Do all students need Tier 2 intervention before going to Tier 3?
Okay, that is a commonly asked question about whether or not kids need to come up through the interventions in order to get a Tier 3 intervention. And the answer is not necessarily. There are students who show up at a school, for example, on return from a stint in a detention center, a juvenile justice facility, a residential treatment center, or some other segregated restrictive setting, and it makes the best sense to bring them back in using the Tier 3 system plan. In the old days, before there were systems of support, there were some, in my opinion, erroneous assumptions that kids needed to be brought back in through restrictive settings. So if you came in through a juvenile justice, you had to go to a self-contained classroom. And now that we have tiered intervention systems, it helps make the reality of reintegration truly reintegration. So that's one example of students who would not need to go through a Tier 1 intervention, a Tier 2 intervention, and then fail in order to have access to a Tier 3 intervention. In addition, there are kids who develop pretty significant issues, experience a trauma, or are just displaying pretty significant behavior problems where it wouldn't be likely to be successful to start them in a Tier 2 intervention. And those students should also have access immediately to a highly individualized support plan in the context of their general education setting. There's some caveats, though, that I would like to make about that. So Tier 3 interventions are not done in isolation. They are done as part of a system of interventions. So what we see with a lot of kids is their Tier 3 intervention plans begin with a highly individualized team, a team of people who are connected to the student, who the student has good relationships with, and people who have knowledge about behavior support. And this highly individualized team talks about how this student can have their needs met and be successful inside the school. And we always look to the Tier 2 and the Tier 1 behavior supports and figure out how we can modify them within the context of a highly individualized plan. So in that regard, Tier 3 interventions are filled with Tier 2 and Tier 1 interventions. But for some kids, we may build that highly individualized team, pick one or two behaviors to zero in on with a function-based behavior plan, or build a person-centered wraparound plan around some of their larger life domain needs in terms of community support, mental health support, physical support, and then we layer in the lower tiered interventions. The other way that students gain access to a Tier 3 plan in a well-developed multi-tiered system of support is that they may have access to Tier 2 interventions, but it quickly becomes apparent that they need to have it kicked up a notch. The big idea here is we do not expect nor want students to experience any significant level of intervention failure. And so we want to have data review and move students quickly to a higher tier. So, for example, there's no set rule that somebody has to be on check-in, check-out for 3 weeks before they're allowed to have access to Tier 3. If it's evident after 2 days that they're not showing up for check-in, check-out, they're tantruming, they're ripping up their point card, we can try to individualize it within 2 days, and we can begin the process of building a Tier 3 plan if we notice they're having difficulties across settings with different people. So we can move rapidly. We do not want a one-size-fits-all rule for access. On the other hand, we have found schools who do not have well-developed Tier 2 systems think too many kids need Tier 3 and move them into individualized supports too fast. So there's a medium ground we need to find here, and we need to constantly be meeting in teams and assessing the entire context of the intervention system. For example, is Johnny not having success with his social skills instructional group because the reinforcement system tied to his participation or his achieving new skills is not meaningful to him? And maybe we could just tweak the reinforcement system and we don't need to kick him all the way up to a Tier 3 intervention. Whereas another student may not acquire the new skills in the small group setting, and may need more function-based interventions that are specifically designed for him. So we always need to be monitoring, checking, and changing. And the key is, what's the likelihood of success and what's the likelihood of the student experiencing failure, which will lead to making everybody's job harder, if you will. So the context of Tier 3 interventions within a multi-tiered systems means we need to be fluid in our thinking, we need to look at data regularly, and we need to not apply one-size-fits-all rules. Some kids need an immediate Tier 3 structure around them, a highly individualized team that meets regularly, that's only about that student. And we need to install their lower tiered interventions in the context of that. Other kids, and this is my last example, other kids come in to a system and we know right away they're going to need a person-centered, let's use the example of a person-centered wraparound plan, where we need to engage their family, build a team, look at their mental health needs, their community needs, their home functioning needs. But while we're in the process of building that team, we can make Tier 1 and Tier 2 as strong as possible and make sure that that student's experiencing some level of success while we're building the Tier 3 structure around them. We see that frequently and successfully in schools with well-developed tiered systems. If all the school is trying to do is Tier 3 only, they don't have the capacity to layer up the successes that end up in a successful Tier 3 plan because they don't have the bottom tiers. So when we're building a RAP plan, we always tell our Tier 3 facilitators when they leave the training, the first thing you can do before you even start engaging the family is tomorrow, when you leave this training, tomorrow you go back to your school, figure out how you can make Tier 1 and check in, check out successful for this kid while you're building the Tier 3 plan. Individualize it somewhat. Talk to the teachers about making sure he gets a certain minimum level of reinforcers in the Tier 1 system. Modify his check-in, check-out to a person he selects and has a relationship with. Add check-in times for him, all while you're building the Tier 3 plan. So the main idea is, do not expect or wait for a student to experience failure until you move into the higher tier, Tier 3 intervention.